There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on.
It's a chilly night in November 1978 in the town of Speedway, Indianapolis, and the four teenagers on shift at the local burger chef are starting to clean up.
Hey Mama, I was just wondering if I could stay back to help close.
Danny Davis is talking to his mum Norma in the back room. He's only 16, and state law dictates that he's only supposed to work until 10 p.m. But his manager, 20-year-old Jayne Freed, wants him to check with his parents if he can stay an extra hour or so. They agree. He joins 16-year-old Mark Flemons and 17-year-old Ruth Shelton as they go through the motions of mopping, wiping and packing away. But when their colleague, fellow teenager Brian Crane, stops by the shop just after midnight to pay his co-workers a visit, he notices something odd. The lights are on, the door is open, but there is no one there. Scared, he calls police.
Thank you, police emergency.
But they very quickly decide it's just a case of a bunch of irresponsible youngsters walking off the job to go party for the night. It is a Friday after all. But none of them return home. And 36 hours later, police receive a devastating call. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. The bodies of Danny, Jayne, Mark and Ruth were found 2 days after their final shift at Burger Chef in late 1978, 20 miles away in a rural field. They'd been shot, stabbed and bashed, each of their murders telling its own devastating tale of the teenagers' last terrifying moments alive. They were all still wearing their orange and brown Burger Chef uniforms. They were all left in the positions they died. Their deaths shocked their small, tight-knit community, but from the start, the police investigation was bungled, and 40 years later, so many questions about that night remain. Aussies Luke Rynderman and Adam Kamien are the co-writers and directors of a new documentary drama called The Speedway Murders, which tries to unpick and unpack the various theories in this case. They've been working on this investigation for 5 years, speaking to families, witnesses, friends and law enforcement about their recollections. Both Luke and Adam join us now. Adam, Luke, you both live in Australia. This crime happened on the other side of the world. So what drew you to revisiting this crime? We'll start with you, Adam.
Luke's a true crime tragic to the point where I worry about him a little bit from time to time. We had just had some interest in a script that we'd written and were kind of looking for the next thing to kind of keep the momentum going. We're big fans of the period, fashion, music. For people who are listening that don't know this, the crime that the film's based on took place in 1978. That was appealing to us. We discovered that it was unsolved. The investigation was botched. So it felt like that it hadn't sort of been given the attention that it should have. So we sort of thought, well, maybe if we do a deep dive, we can uncover some stuff. So we sort of went down this rabbit hole and never really emerged.
Luke, is there a reason you didn't decide to go down a more Australian unsolved crime?
I mean, there's definitely Australian unsolved crimes that we're interested in, but, we were looking all over the world and, there was just a certain tragedy to the fact that it wasn't solved. And, there was 4 people at the centre of young people that nothing had been done about and, the families not knowing. And so, it just kind of like it hit us. And as Adam said, we, never really come up from it.
The crime itself happened on the same weekend as the Jonestown massacre. So it had always kind of gotten short shrift. It never really got the attention that it deserved, which was another thing that sort of enticed us.
Before we get more into the crime, I'd love to get a bit more background on you two. You guys have known each other for a long time, haven't you?
It's true. We were introduced by a mutual friend in, I think, 1989. So we've kind of been really tight ever since.
What's it like working on a project this big, this in-depth, this kind of gruesome with your best mate?
It's a great friendship tester.
It can be maddening at times. I mean, we do piss each other off at times, and it is definitely a tester. And, going over and doing, various trips to Indianapolis and staying very closely together, does test the friendship. We never fight about anything not creative. It's always creative issues. So it's never like anything about the person. It's just, we're both so passionate about it.
The burger chef we're talking about is in a place called Speedway in Indianapolis. Adam, what's that part of America like?
It's Midwest, so it's sort of in the heartland. Most people, when they go and visit America, they don't tend to go to the Midwest. They go to the coasts, sort of LA or New York or, maybe a Chicago or something like that, which actually is just kind of on top of Indiana where this is. In a lot of ways, it's the real America. Indianapolis is kind of a small town. I think there's under 1 million people there. And Speedway is kind of a town within Indianapolis, a suburb within Indianapolis, I guess. They're an extremely hospitable people. And, if you sort of venture outside the city, it's a lot of cornfields and diners and that sort of typical middle America.
You've mentioned that we're talking 1978, and around the time of this crime, there had actually been quite a few violent incidents. Can you set that scene for us?
So Speedway is this little enclave, I guess, that by all reports was kind of a sleepy little hamlet. People didn't tend to lock their doors. It was a safe place to grow up. It was an auto parts industry, was the sort of economic driver. Something happened in the late 70s. This kind of hellmouth opens in Speedway, and all of a sudden we've got bike gangs, we've got drugs, we've got violent crime, murder, and a lot of these things play into the theories surrounding what happened at the Burger Chef. And in a lot of ways, it's quite maddening when you're trying to investigate a crime because there were so many bad actors in Speedway at the time, chop shops as well, so places that would sort of steal cars and piece them out, that it's kind of hard to narrow the field. It's hard to kind of rule anybody out when you look at people that you think may have been capable of something as heinous as the quadruple murder of 4 kids. In Speedway specifically at the time, there were plenty of people with form.
How was the initial disappearance of these 4 young people discovered on that night or on that following morning in November 1978?
There was an employee that was working there that went out on a date with another employee, and as he dropped his date off, he went back to see if they needed help closing and came in the back door, and then subsequently found it open, and then went in and saw that the safe had been ransacked and some things were sort of like out of place. And he rang the manager, and then the manager rang police, and then police came down.
And what did they do? Did they move quickly? Did they ignore it?
So in their infinite wisdom, they let them reopen the restaurant the next day for business as usual, hoping that the kids had just kind of taken the money and gone off to party.
In 2024, it's hard to comprehend that. Revisiting that yourselves, is that like a normal thing to do in policing in the late 70s, to just kind of ignore something that looks quite sinister and a bit like a crime scene?
I think everybody accepts now it was a mistake that kind of hamstrung the case, really. Speedway police at the time, remember, is kind of a small town, and even though there was a lot of violent crime, they wouldn't have had to deal with many quadruple murders, and I think they just botched it and continued to botch it from there. They restaged the crime scene a few days later so they could take crime scene photos. The kids were taken from the Burger Chef, but they were actually discovered about half an hour away in a wooded area in Johnson County. There were things taken from that site in Johnson County. There were police that were fired later for being drunk on the job, and the whole thing was just a complete mess.
I think like originally, first 48 hours, which is obviously we know now the most important in an investigation. I think, they were hopeful, because it was so under-resourced that, first of all, that they did just go off and they were just going to turn up again. And then I think that they were hoping then that it would be a kidnapping and there would be a ransom And then from there, when they found the bodies 48 hours later, that's when panic set in for them that they'd done the wrong thing.
Luke, can you expand a bit on how the bodies were found and in what state? What had happened to those 4 young people?
Danny and Ruth were found very close together, almost touching, like legs kind of touching. They were both shot in the back of the head. There was, I think, 2 shots in each of them. And then a little bit further away, Jayne was found stabbed in the heart, 2 stab wounds in her chest. And it appears to be that was over the shoulder. So either she was running or someone came up behind her and surprised her and she was stabbed twice. And then even further away, which is an infinite source of conversation between me and Adam and other people, Mark was found, and he was found where his back was sort of like laid back on his legs, and he actually drowned on his own blood. So either he hit a tree branch as he was running or someone with a baseball bat.
I mean, all murders are horrific, but what you've just described is horrifying. Like, those final moments for those kids would have been horrendous.
Yeah.
I mean, we've thought a lot about that. It's horrifying and it's confounding as well because, you've got 3 different modes of death. It's hard to make sense of it. It sort of suggests a frenzied attack, but we just don't know exactly what happened once they got the kids out to Johnson County. Did they take them out there intending to kill them? Did, as someone in our film says, they went out there to buy themselves time. Something went wrong out there. We just don't know. But I think what you're describing, those last few moments for the kids, haunts us. And, we know, obviously, for Teresa and Norma, it's the stuff of nightmares. Teresa being Ruth Shelton, one of the victims' sisters, and Norma is Danny, who was another victim, his mum.
Well, let's focus a little bit more on their lives. Who were these teenagers? One of them was 20, so a young woman. Ruth, Mark, Jayne, Danny. What do we know about them as people?
We've read a lot about them and also spoken to their families. So Jayne, from all accounts was friendly, vivacious, loved animals, loved art, was working her way up pretty quickly in the burger chef, other burger chefs as well. She'd come from another store called Plainfield and, was ambitious and doing really well within that company. Mark was good at school, athletic, popular, from everybody that was spoken to, all around a good guy. Ruth had actually come from the Dunkin' Donuts next door where she worked and had only really just started at the Burger Chef. She was into computers. She probably would have been a pioneer in that area, because it was the 70s. Danny was into photography and also wanted to join the Air Force.
Your film really tries to focus on these people as people, not just victims, which is something that in the true crime genre, some creators seem to have gotten a bit carried away with. Was that a big focus for you guys?
Yeah, it was. In the course of the research, we became quite close with, in particular, Teresa and also Norma. We felt that we owed it to them, that this film wasn't gratuitous, that this film was there to memorialise their loved ones rather than having them be kind of pawns in something salacious and gratuitous, something that exploits them for the sake of entertainment. That was always front of mind for us, and that's what drove us. So, you'll notice in the film there's really very little. I mean, there's one sort of description of the death scene, as Luke said, and other than that, we chose not to recreate that element of the story out of respect for them. And I think Teresa says it in the film, it's so often the boogeymen in these cases that get notarized and the victims are sort of forgotten. And we really wanted to sort of flip that on its head, and that was the focus in the writing.
And how do you cast and film something like this when you're both based in Australia, but you're dealing with an American crime? How did that process go?
We cast Australian actors. We cast the net far and wide, and we lucked out with 4 sort of early career actors who were just extraordinary. They worked extensively with a dialect coach. The Midwestern drawl's a really sort of specific kind of accent. It's not just a straight American accent. And we had kind of built characters for them. You know, it was on the page in the script. At the end of the day, you know, it was 1978. We didn't have a ton of archive family videos or anything like that. So, you know, there was a lot that was left to them to fill in, their mannerisms, things like that. To their great credit, each of the four actors, Joe Zada, Essie Randalls, Nia Coffey and Davida McKenzie, were just incredibly dedicated, gave so much of themselves, researched, worked incredibly diligently, and, you know, it's reflected in their performances.
Does that mean you also created the Burger Chef here in Australia?
Yeah, so we built it in Adelaide. We found an abandoned Chinese restaurant. The geography was pretty much exactly the same as the site in Indiana. And so with a lot of research and an amazing team, we were able to like gut the building, knock down walls, put windows in, and pretty much build it down to the cup.
Were there any moments from filming, either with the actors or with the real people from this story, that really stand out to either of you?
There's so many. I think the one that sort of stayed with me the most was the day that we all interviewed Norma, who was Danny's mum. She's someone who's, you know, to move on has sort of had to compartmentalise it, doesn't talk about it a lot, doesn't do any media. We ended up meeting her and developing a bit of a rapport, and she ended up agreeing to go on camera. That was a really, really tough day, particularly given that Danny had called her that night because somebody else was supposed to come in and help close, but Danny called his mum that night and said, hey, you know, can I hang back and do a couple of extra hours, because he was quite young and supposed to be home by 10:30. He called and asked if he could stay back and help for the extra couple of hours pay so he could buy Christmas presents. They were reluctant, but Danny's mum and his dad agreed that he would do that, and it was the last time they ever spoke to him. So hearing her recount that story and seeing just the guilt and the trauma was a really tough day.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with Luke Rynderman and Adam Kamien about the Speedway murders. Well, there are a number of witnesses to the night in question that you've spoken to. I want to focus firstly on the two people that gave the descriptions that ended up being widely circulated at the time. Luke, what kind of description did they give? Who were police and the public being told to look out for?
So there were two witnesses that were behind the Dunkin' Donuts, or sort of like there was a train line behind, and they were approached by two men who told them to kind of move on. One of the men was long-haired with a beard, and the other was clean-shaven with shorter blonde hair, which is basically like describing every man in the 70s. Subsequently, they then did police sketches based on their descriptions, and then also these really weird busts that were made out of clay by, like, I think it was one of the detectives' nieces who went to art school. And they're like synonymous with this case. They are really very freaky and out there.
I was going to say they look like an art project, and interestingly, they are.
It's worth Googling for people who are listening, because it really is quite wild that anyone would release these two ridiculous busts to the public.
And then they were put on public display, like in malls, for people to kind of walk past and look at and then find those two people. So that was quite unique, actually. That was one of the first things that I saw when I was like researching the case and kind of drawn to it, that these busts were, you know, what was given to the public.
Adam, one of the early prominent theories was that these four became victims of a local robbery gang. Can you talk us through who they were? What were they doing at the time?
Yeah, this was a crew of guys from around the Johnson County area who had been robbing KFCs, other fast food restaurants, and in particular there were a few burger chefs that they'd knocked over as well. It was a theory that came from Indiana State Police detective at the time called Ken York. And it's a theory that some people in law enforcement and others still believe is the answer. I think if you knew nothing about this case and you kind of came to the robber gang theory, which is what we've called it in the film, it's incredibly compelling. It's very convincing. We think that there are some holes in it. People always say that the MO of the robber gang coming in through the back door at closing when somebody was taking out the trash. The reality is nobody knows that. And yes, the back door was found ajar, but how the kids were taken out of the restaurant is a complete mystery because, you know, this is something that we sort of try to address in the film. The hours between about 11:30 when we believe the kids were taken and sort of roughly 1:30 a.m. the next morning when shots are heard out at Johnson County is kind of this black hole in time that, you know, people speculate over endlessly. And the robber gang is one of the more kind of convincing theories that you hear.
Luke, tell me about Donald Forrester. How did he become involved in this case?
Donald Forrester was a known bad actor in the area who was in jail for a violent rape where he was serving 95 years. He came to police attention and then subsequently confessed twice and then recounted twice. We play some of the second confession in the film where it feels like he's being led. You know, some of his answers don't really kind of correlate with how the bodies were actually found. And, you know, the talk was that, you know, he was actually shown into the war room and kind of got to see a lot of the crime scene photographs before he had his confession. So in the end, recounted for the second time and then they didn't have enough to prosecute. So it was pretty much dropped.
But why would he want to confess to a crime he didn't do?
He was in a pretty bad prison at the time and wanted to be moved. And I think through the kind of police leverage, they were going to move him into like a nicer, cushier prison. So, you know, he felt like, you know, if he gave this confession that, you know, better treatment.
Adam, it's kind of obvious to look at the victims themselves and see whether there's any possible links there to see whether, you know, they could have enemies or anyone potentially out to get them. What were you able to find out about that? I understand that there was a bit of a focus on Mark for a second and then a lot of focus on Jayne and her family.
Both Mark and Jayne had brothers who had their problems with the law. Jayne's brother in particular, who did kind of fit the description of the bearded man, he had a sort of shock of brown hair and a beard at the time. He was running with a motorcycle gang called the Sons of Silence and ended up being arrested for cocaine possession, I think, at the time, and was associated with a lot of other bad actors. Interestingly, one of whom was Donald Forrester, we believe. So he's one that comes up a lot because you often hear speculation about whether drugs were being dealt out of the burger chef. Apparently this was not an uncommon thing that they would move small amounts of marijuana through drive-up windows when people would come to order their food. So there's speculation that that was happening. If it was happening, did Jayne know about it, which kind of snowballed into it. Jayne was dealing drugs and ended up in trouble because of that. This is something that Luke and I go back and forth on. I'm less convinced about that. I haven't really seen any evidence that Jayne was dealing drugs, nor have I seen any evidence that Mark was dealing drugs. So one of the things that people speculated about is, you know, could it have been drug-related but through Jayne's brother? And, you know, Charlie Gray, who was dating Jayne at the time that she died, said that, in fact, she would have tried to protect her brother had that happened, if it came to that. So, you know, was the debt being collected that night owed by James Freed, Jayne's brother? You know, the other one is Mark's brother. Less is known about him, but he also had his issues and was in and out of prison.
There was one eyewitness called Alan who gave actual names that he says he saw that night. Jeff Freed and Tim Willoughby. Adam, who were they and what did Alan say that he saw that night?
Mary and George, who were the teenagers who were sitting on the tracks, they claim to have seen these two men that moved them on. But there's only one person that claims to have seen anything other than that, and that is Alan Pruitt, who turns up drunk to the Dunkin' Donuts with a friend, goes outside to get some air because he's feeling unwell, and says he sees an orange van pull up and he recognises two people. They are Jeff Reed and Tim Willoughby. In terms of what Alan Pruitt saw, it depends on the day that you talk to him, unfortunately. He was, how should we put it, a bit of an unreliable narrator, to the point where in 1981 he gave a statement to Jim Kramer, who was a detective who had the case for the best part of 25 years, I think. And that statement drove the investigation from the state police for a really long time. In talking to us, so many parts of his story fell apart, and we sort of gave him the opportunity. We said to him, listen, because what he claims is that he was kind of under pressure and felt like police were going to pin the crime on him because he had been there. He was also a kind of ne'er-do-well. He said that he just starts making stuff up to sort of divert their attention somewhere else. So, in our conversations with him, he ends up walking back almost all of what he said in that 1981 statement. But he maintains, and I think in the film he says, and I will take this to the grave, that he saw that van and Jeff Reed and Tim Willoughby, and that's something that he never walked back. So Jeff Reed and Tim Willoughby we probably need a separate interview to talk about Tim Willoughby because that's a crazy story. Local bad actor involved with chop shops. Jeff Reed was a local character who was known as the mayor of the Snake Pit, which was sort of a turn. Speedway is named for the Indianapolis 500 race, and there's a turn on the racetrack that in the month of May is like a kind of party place, and that's called the Snake Pit, and Jeff Reed was the mayor of the Snake Pit. He was known as a guy who could be violent. He was known as a guy who would collect debts.
I know you say that Alan might not be the most credible witness, but he's not the only person that mentions Jeff, and this is potentially the biggest bombshell from your documentary. You have a mate of Jeff's who told you something quite remarkable. Tell me about what Tim told you.
So Tim dropped a bombshell that Jeff came to him and had somewhat of a confession that he wanted to get off his chest, that, he was there that night and subsequently things got out of hand and he was forced to handle a situation and pretty much confessed details of what happened that night.
So he knew kind of what happened to those kids.
Yeah, so he was there and was partly responsible and felt like he needed to get it off his chest to his very good friend Tim, and dropped this bombshell of a story on him.
So why had Tim never gone to police with this information?
I mean, he claims that the police never came to him. He's never seen the police. The police were never interested. After we filmed this segment, we took him down to the prosecutor's office and dropped him off and basically waited for him to go in and tell his story. So we had done everything that we could to give everything over to the police that we had, including Tim and his bombshell story.
It's one thing to want to tell a story like you guys did. You're making a film about an unsolved case, but to get information like this that is brand new, that hasn't been heard by police or anyone, how did it feel for you in that moment to actually hear something like this?
It was exhilarating, if I'm honest. It's a real emotional roller coaster when you're so invested in something like this. Sometimes it's maddening because you keep coming up against dead ends. We're otherwise hopeful. Some days are the days where you get to speak to someone like a Tim Boyer, and I remember I had gotten on to him and he didn't reveal everything to me on the phone because he was pretty adamant that he wanted to talk to us face to face to give us the whole story. But he gave me enough information over the phone that I remember getting off the phone, it's 2 a.m. because of the time difference, and calling Luke and saying, hey, I think I know what happened. So, that was pretty special.
So where does that leave us in terms of an investigation? Are police still looking into this? Is it currently still cold?
The reason that this case is still unsolved, it's partly because the police botched the investigation early on, but there's also very, very little physical evidence, which makes it extremely challenging. We know they have tested DNA in the past, what little DNA they did have, and we know that they're sort of preserving some other DNA in the hope that technology improves, because when you test a DNA sample, often you destroy that sample. so they don't want to shoot their shot right now. But there's very, very little physical evidence, which makes closing the case challenging.
What do you think the families hope they're going to get from sharing their stories with you and from having this crime retold on such a big platform? Do you think that they're hopeful that that slim chance of actually getting a conviction or justice in any way is still what they're kind of leaning towards?
They want answers. They want to know. The not knowing is the hardest part. People often sort of throw around the word closure. I think when you lose a loved one in a fashion as brutal as this, there's probably not ever really closure. But I think for some peace of mind, knowing what happened in their final moments would help. I think that's what they're desperate for. So our great hope in doing this, and really it's kind of been one of the driving factors, is that someone sitting somewhere will see this and call authorities, and it'll be a tip that breaks the case open.
Thanks to Luke Rynderman and Adam Kamien for assisting us to tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another true crime conversation.